The diagrammatic Cine-Carotgraphy of Foucault. What does a Foucault film look like through Deleuze's camera lens? Foucault as film. Through cinematography as a Deleuzian mode of interpretation, philosophies can appear as cinematic perspectives on other philosophers. Cinematographicum Philosophicum. Foucault's cinematography is in itself a cinematic diagram consisting of the archive, the visible and the sayable, as well as power, which consists of relations of force. The visible and the sayable do not align and are applicable in this way and only in this way to the genesis of breaks in history, the discursive and the non-discursive. Time image. Deleuze's concept of the horse charm clarifies this operation. The acoustic element extends beyond the image in a direction that has two aspects. On the one hand, it refers to a relative exterior, to a space adjacent to the image, to a beside, to other possible images that could continue the visible ensemble, to an off-screen that continues beyond the frame. On the other hand, it points to an absolute exterior, to a whole that never fully actualizes itself, to a power, a duration, a change that transcends every individual ensemble. For Foucault, this dual direction can be made immediately productive. The relative exterior corresponds to the concrete historical milieus, institutions, spaces, bodies and practices in which statements circulate. The absolute exterior corresponds to the diagram, that distribution of forces, invisible and unspeakable, which determines what can become visible and speakable within a historical formation. Foucaultian cinematography can therefore be understood as an investigation of those audiovisual cuts in which the visible and the sayable do not correspond to one another. Sound or speech is not a complement to the image, but its counter-realization. It brings to light in the image what the image itself cannot show, its exterior, its condition, its diagrammatic power. To transpose Foucault into film therefore means reading the archive as an acoustic visual continuum, whose elements cannot be reduced to units of meaning, but rather differentiate themselves at every moment in two directions, toward possible images and toward a virtual exterior that never quite becomes an image. Image and sound capacities. Deleuze locates the transformation of the image in a new mode of the sayable as a visual that is becoming archaeological or stratigraphic. The fact that their relationship is called into question ensures that one can reflect on the connection itself, a connection that would otherwise be overlooked or rendered imperceptible. Image and sound or speech complement each other. The off ensures the compatibility of images and sounds. The image reaches its level of constitution when it is called into question by the distinct capacity of sound. By liberating the connection between image and sound, the image can now be interpreted. If the images no longer follow a natural sequence, if they reveal that false transitions and cuts are used systematically, then one could say that the shots themselves turn or reverse and that perceiving them requires a considerable effort of memory and imagination, in other words, a reading. Reading within images is the key point that links Deleuze to Foucault and presents him as an extension to the cinematographic method of reading. For Foucault too, image and sound do not align, which leads him to the discontinuities in history and prompts the question of where they come from and why it becomes possible to make a specific statement at a specific time. Reading then means reassembling the images, because one becomes aware of the cut, in this context also of the normalization brought about by the cut. Reading means rotating and reversing the images, following a new kind of analysis. Reading means carrying out precisely this transformation, which in turn is an archaeological process, because one moves from the seen to the spoken to the imagined and the remembered. In short, it is through the intersection of the visible and the sayable, through their separation, that one must read. This is what constitutes the archaeological cut. The facets of the image are constantly interweaved and exchanged. The task is to uncover the layers of the visual image. Deleuze finds a Foucauldian archaeology present in Rossellini, in other words, an archaeological conception, almost in the sense of Michel Foucault. Speech, acts, and visible space each oscillate between the old and the new in their respective concepts of history. Thus, speech, acts bring forth something that is not yet present in the images, and the figures oriented towards the past bring forth something in the image that language cannot yet capture. The irrational cut presupposes the new stage of the acoustic. Foucault focuses on these intersections, which take on a particular form when one argues that it is power that determines how the visible and the sayable are separated from one another and how they interact. The faculty reaches its limit and functions in its own right. The external nature or condition of the visual becomes apparent when the image itself is driven to a limit, and this occurs through its reference to the other faculty, that of sound or language. Through this, the visible can see that it is seeing the non-visible. It functions by disengaging from its own function, but on the level of the other faculty. When the voice-over discusses the image and refers to something in the image that is not visible. However, as soon as one unpacks the words and the things, as soon as one discovers the statements and the visibilities, speaking and seeing rise to a higher, a priori endeavor, so that both reach their own limit, which separates them from the other, a visible that can only be seen, a sayable that can only be said. The boundary is the shared one that establishes a relationship while separating. It has two faces, a silent gaze and a blind speech. The time image examines the interplay between the two levels of the audiovisual. None of the two faculties can, from that point on, attain a higher level of exercise without reaching the boundary that separates it from the other and, at the same time, relates it to the other by separating them both. Only when the visual and the auditory stand in a free, indirect relationship can we begin to consider how they manifest themselves, how the transition unfolds from non-layered milieus or diagrams to the stratifications of the visible and the sayable. The visibility of punishment changed in the 17th century. There was no longer any marking on the body, but the light of the disciplinary order, by appealing to the expressibility of punishment, established a different relationship between visible and expressible forms of surveillance and punishment. The microphysics of power need not manifest itself in visible effects of power, but consists of strategies and techniques. The desire is to venture into the exterior in order to discover the origin of the connection that prevails within the layered formations between the visible and the sayable in the strategic zone. From a Foucauldian perspective, there are discontinuities in the history of knowledge that indicate that power relations are changing and do not emanate from a single center of power, but rather express differential relationships within knowledge and the conception of power that becomes visible in these formations of knowledge. Up until Discipline and Punish, Foucault conducted analysis of layers. There is always a distinction between the field of visibility, for example, the asylum and those confined there, and statements as a form of expression, for example, criminal law. The layers are sedimentary superimpositions, formed from things and words, from seeing and speaking, the visible and the sayable, zones of visibility and fields of legibility, contents and expression. Expressing the disjunction between seeing and speaking on film, the two orders, the visible and the sayable, do not exist on the same plane. The visible contains a virtuality that can be partially actualized by the sayable. Films in which voices have no visible location and in which visual elements show no correlation with what is said. The archive fulfills its function. It allows the statement to act as a diagonal when a rupture occurs between the visible and the sayable. There is a constant irrational break between the two. The portrait of Foucault is built on the struggle between the visible and the sayable, which mutually interpenetrate and collide, causing one to manifest itself in the other. His syntax captures the reflections, the sparkle of the visible, but also bends like a belt, folding and unfolding or snapping in time with the statements. But when the sayable is permeated by the abundance of the visible, they give rise to one another. The statements now glided back and forth between the visible and its condition, just as they did between Magritte's two pipes. Visibilities creep in between the statement and its condition, as in Roussel, who does not open up the words without allowing the visible to emerge. The diagram as a cinematographic moment of operation. The visible and the sayable are linked on the diagram, which governs the exchange. It is the map of power relation. The panopticism of surveillance and punishment is a diagram that reveals power relations and regulates what is visible and what is sayable. The panoptic apparatus is not simply a hinge or an exchange regulator between a mechanism of power and a function. It brings power relations within a function to the fore and thereby enhances that function. The point is how Foucault can speak of the diagram as the dominant diagram in the sense of an image of thought at a given time. The diagram is no longer the audiovisual archive. It is the map, the cartography, coextensive with the totality of the social field. It is an abstract machine. By defining itself through informal functions and materials, it ignores any formal distinction between content and expression, between a discursive formation and a non-discursive formation. The diagram is the virtual plane that brings about visibilities and sayabilities and govern their relationships to one another, without itself being visible or sayable. Deleuze's approach to other philosophies can be described as the virtualization of positions of thought, insofar as he reconstructs them in such a way that one finds within them what was not there before, in order to show that their foundation in difference is not predetermined, thereby exposing their in essence in constant transformation. Within the familiar, unknown constellations of problems are revealed as if he were giving them different masks with roles they have not yet played.